Hey everyone! So it's finally time to talk about the third SFML book I've read. It's called SFML Game Development, written back in 2013 by Arthur Moreira, Jen Holler, and Henrik Vogelus Hansen. I still have no idea how to pronounce that last name correctly. If you watched my previous SFML book reviews, then you already know I set myself a goal: read 5 SFML books. This is book number 3. I actually read I read this one years ago already, and out of the 3 books so far, this one is definitely the hardest. It's almost 300 pages long, split into 10 chapters, and unlike the previous books, this one focuses entirely on a single huge project that grows chapter by chapter. Now, this book is not really about learning SFML itself. It's mostly about game architecture using SFML. So if you know absolutely nothing about SFML and want to start with this book, I really would not recommend it. The book can absolutely give you some useful architectural ideas and teach you how to structure larger projects better, but if your goal is actually learning SFML, I still think SFML Essentials does a much better job. SFML Essentials didn't really build a complete game. SFML Blueprints gave us 5 smaller finished projects, but this book goes all in on one giant project that touches basically every major SFML module: graphics, audio, shaders, cameras, networking, multiplayer, pretty much everything. And since the book came out in 2013, the newest C++ standard it uses is C++11. So it also uses SFML 2.0, while right now we already have SFML 3.1. That becomes a huge problem. If you try using the latest SFML version with this book, a lot of the code simply will not compile anymore. SFML changed so much over the years that many of the examples need to be rewritten manually. So if you still want to follow this book today, I'd recommend either learning SFML2 first and using the old version while reading the book, or learning modern SFML separately and manually adapting the code yourself. Now, let me quickly go through the chapters so you understand what you're getting into. The first chapter introduces the SFML modules, shows where to download the library, how basic includes work, and gives you a tiny test example to check if SFML is installed correctly. The author does not explain how to actually install SFML though. You're expected to figure that out yourself. You can either use the official SFML tutorials or, honestly, my own videos if you want a more detailed explanation. After that, the author starts talking about writing proper C++ code and good architecture, because that's supposed to be the main focus of the book. The problem is, the book has a lot of issues. Sometimes the author talks about code without actually showing it. Sometimes he explains one thing while displaying completely different code on the screen. You'll also notice screenshots showing an FPS counter that the author never explains anywhere. So clearly there's extra code being used behind the scenes that just never made it into the book. And honestly, if you try building the game exactly alongside the author, there is a good chance you'll completely break mentally halfway through the book, maybe earlier. The game itself is a top-down shooter where you control an airplane. You can shoot enemies, collect power-ups that affect health, damage, fire rate, even bullet trajectories. There are 2 enemy types. The camera constantly scrolls upward, and you fight through levels until reaching the end. You can also play through LAN multiplayer with a friend. At first, the author explains how the game class should work. You learn how to draw a simple circle, what a game loop is, how event processing works in SFML, and eventually you get introduced to vector math. Then he explains why movement without delta time is bad, and even shows several delta time implementations, which is actually pretty useful. By the end of chapter 1, you already have a plane moving around on a black screen. Chapter 2 focuses entirely on resources and architecture. The author explains textures, fonts, sounds, how resources relate to each other, and how to build a shared resource manager using templates. So this chapter is much more about improving architecture that adding gameplay features. In Chapter 3, we finally start building an entity hierarchy. We create a base entity class, then an aircraft class for different plane types. The author explains SFML transformations like translation, rotation, and scaling, and then introduces a scene graph system. Now, scene graphs are actually a pretty powerful architectural idea if they're explained well. Unfortunately, this was one of the hardest parts of the book for me to understand. And the author doesn't slow down at all. Right after that, we start implementing layered backgrounds, attaching them to the scene graph, adding an SFML view camera, learning about viewports, resolution, aspect ratios, camera movement, zooming, rotation, all of that. Then we create sprite node classes, repeat textures infinitely, and finally end up with a scrolling desert level where our plane flies together with allied aircraft. The next chapter introduces a full command system. Basically, key presses trigger commands, commands trigger actions, and actions affect entities. The chapter starts by explaining SFML events, which is good, but there are barely any small practical examples to help beginners actually understand them. Then, the author explains the difference between real-time input and event-based input, and after that, we spent forever building this giant command architecture, and honestly, it becomes extremely bloated and difficult to follow. I constantly had to use outside sources that just to understand what was happening because the explanations in the book really weren't enough. Then things get even more complicated. In chapter 5, the author introduces game states. Main menu, gameplay, pause screen, game over screen, all of these become separate states managed through a state stack. As an experienced developer, I understand why this architecture exists, but for beginners, this is going to be brutal. If this is your first SFML book, I honestly think you have almost no chance of fully understanding this chapter. If it's your third or fourth book, maybe. What makes it worse is that the author sometimes introduces entire systems that never even get used later. For example, he briefly explains a SAF threat, which doesn't even exist anymore in SFML 3, and then never uses it. He also builds a loading screen system and then never uses that either. So at some point, you start wondering why any of this is even here. Chapter 6 finally focuses on UI systems. We build buttons, menus, and a UI architecture. The main menu has a background sprite and 3 buttons: play, settings, and exit. Personally, I really don't like his UI architecture. I think it could have been much simpler and way more modular, but technically it works, and for beginners, it's still useful to see one possible approach. Later, we also build a settings menu where players can rebind movement keys. Chapter 7 is where the gameplay finally becomes more interesting. We add health bars, enemies with different stats and textures, attach text to sprites, create movement patterns for enemies, implement basic AI behavior, enemy spawning, bullets, rockets with homing behavior, collectible power-ups, and eventually collision handling between all these objects. And honestly, collision handling becomes one of the hardest parts of the chapter. Then comes chapter 8. This chapter is painful. This is where shaders and visual effects get introduced. We add particle systems for missile smoke, glowing text effects, sprite sheet animations, explosions, airplane tilt animations, and the author suddenly starts diving into OpenGL concepts. You learn about render targets, render textures, post-processing, and rendering scenes into textures before applying shaders. The problem is that almost none of this is explained clearly enough. Especially the particle system. It turns into this giant pile of classes doing mysterious things for unclear reasons. And the glow effect explanation is honestly terrible, extremely minimal, poorly explained, and it really feels like the author added features he simply didn't know how to teach properly. Chapter 9 is finally a bit of a break. we add sounds and music. The game gets a music player system, sound effects, and even positional 3D audio where sounds shift between left and right speakers depending on object position. So here you learn things like listeners, attenuation factors, and minimal distance. Compared to previous chapters, this one is actually pretty understandable, which proves the author can explain things well when he wants to. And finally, the book ends with multiplayer. At first, networking theory is actually pretty decent. The explanations of sockets, TCP, UDP, IP addresses, socket selectors, custom protocols, data transfer, peer-to-peer vs client-server architecture, all of that is surprisingly understandable. But the moment we start integrating networking into the giant architectural mess built throughout the rest of the book, everything completely falls apart. I was reading almost every page of this chapter with pure confusion. My head genuinely hurt while reading it. I constantly caught myself thinking, why am I even reading this? And in the end, I never managed to fully implement the multiplayer system. But at least I finished the book. So, what's my overall opinion? This book is hard, very hard, and it gets progressively harder with every chapter. I absolutely do not think this book is for beginners. To understand it properly, you probably need to already know SFML pretty well or have read at least 2 SFML books beforehand. But then, that creates another problem. If you already understand SFML well enough, why would you even read this book? There are compile errors, missing code, code that only exists in the repository but not in the book, bad formatting, hard to read fonts, poor identifier naming, inconsistent explanations. The experience is honestly frustrating. Still, if you somehow survive this book until the very end, it can improve your understanding of game architecture with SFML, or at least improve it a little bit, assuming you even understand what's happening. So personally, I do not recommend this book to anyone. At this point, I already read 3 SFML books, and honestly, all 3 of them were disappointing. Next, I'm moving on to game development by example. It's much bigger than this one, and hopefully it'll actually be more enjoyable. Anyway, that's it for this review. Thanks everybody for watching. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, write a comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. You can also support me through the donation link in the description, through YouTube Thanks, or by becoming a channel member to get access to practical videos where you can reinforce the concepts from my theoretical lessons. See you in the next review. Bye everyone.